We're very pleased to welcome Professor Gareth Jones here this evening, who's been on sabbatical here at college for the past term. He's Professor of Anatomy and Structural Biology at the University of Otago in Dunedin in New Zealand. And in fact, he's been there since 1983. Prior to that, he was in the University of Western Australia and then originally at University College Hospital in London. So he's quite a regular visitor back to the UK. And Gareth is a neuroscientist who's really developed very extensive interests in the ethical issues surrounding not only the neurosciences, but more of what he's going to be speaking on this evening, the reproductive technologies over the past few years. And I'm sure that some here will be familiar with his books on these topics. I'm going to wave them in the air now because I might forget at the end. But there's a couple of books by Gareth on the book table. Valuing People, Human Value in a World of Medical Technology, also Clones, the Clowns of Technology, on the little bookstore we've got there at the back, together with some reprints, but I'll mention them again later on. We will, of course, have questions and discussion at the end, so there will be plenty of time for that, and there's plenty of seats up here for those who just made it up the stairs, so congratulations for finding us to come in. So I'll hand over, without more ado, to Professor Jones, who's going to speak on scientific, ethical and theological challenges of the new reproductive technologies.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Just a couple of things before I start. There was a sort of... we crossed our wires a bit about having a PowerPoint here, so I'm not someone who works in the humanities and never has anything up on screens. I normally do. So, but I don't tonight, so you can have a look at the nicer view instead. The other thing is, while I can speak with, I suppose, quite a number of hats on this occasion I will have a little bit of a sort of a theological hat as well, although, of course, I'm not a theologian. But I will be putting something of a Christian perspective on what I say. Now, this notion of playing God, I think it raises its fairly ugly head in most scientific domains. And I think the intended message, most of the time anyway, is that whatever is being talked about is forbidden territory, because the term is generally used negatively. We are going where we should not be going. We are walking into an area that should be left to God. Not only this, but I think the word play signifies a meddling with serious matters. We don't have to play, and we don't have to indulge in these activities, whatever they might be. And so not only are we entering forbidden territory, but we are doing so needlessly. Life would be much safer if left well alone. Why don't we accept that we are limited beings and that there are certain things outside our grasp, now and possibly forever? Playing God, then, generally has connotations of inquiring into things that lie outside the scope of our interests, or at least that should lie outside the scope of our interests. It's treading on the toes of God. We are aiming, so it is often said, to become godlike in our powers. In theological terms, it's often seen as our eating of the tree of good and evil, succumbing to the temptation to be like God and refusing to accept God-ordained limitations. But what does the notion of playing God actually mean? Is it nearly as negative as frequently thought? The criticism that a procedure is akin to playing God tends to reflect hostility towards that particular procedure, rather than presenting a clear rationale as to the way in which it might transgress divine boundaries. A good number of years ago, the theologian Paul Ramsey commented that human beings should not play God before they have learnt to be human beings. And when they are human beings, they will not want to play God. Now, I think that's a superb quotation, but I think it fails to throw any light whatsoever on what human beings should or shouldn't do in any scientific area. And I think the most one tends to elicit from such uses of the term is that the present human form is divinely ordained and shouldn't be modified in any manner. But of course that leaves in limbo the numerous uses made of things like vaccines, antibiotics, surgery, preventive medicine, genetic counselling. Are these illicit illustrations of playing God? Or somehow do they manage to escape this criticism? Now, from a Christian standpoint, we are made in God's image and therefore are to function, at least in some ways, like God. And so no matter how much our God-likeness has been shattered by rebellion against God, we are still images of our Maker, even if we are tarnished images. And so we demonstrate a great deal of his creativity and his inquisitiveness. And so we can say then that humans as scientists are humans as God's images, probing and thrusting into the creation, attempting to understand it and sometimes to redirect it as stewards of God's creation. And of course, within the medical sphere, the desire is to exercise at least limited control over what many take to be evil in the form of diseases that would otherwise ravish and destroy all that is beautiful and worthy in God's world. But of course, underlying all these attributes is a proviso, and this is that the control is exercised in a responsible manner. When this isn't the case, we of course see the other side of the picture. And the other side of the picture is that scientists may be arrogant and unworthy. They may have motives of self-aggrandizement and personal glory. And they may even show little regard for the welfare of individual humans, even when the realm within which they are working is that of medicine. For instance, any attempt to create some new creature with superlative powers would stem, one imagines, from human conceit regarding the unlimited powers of human abilities. But I think we should remind ourselves that that sort of science fiction scenario equates with what I would call playing the devil. It has nothing to do with playing God. So from a Christian perspective, then, we are not to use massive scientific powers for superficial and frivolous ends. There are, of course, always dangers. And to risk these for very minor gains is always dangerous and irresponsible. So much, I think, of the criticism of genetics revolves around its possible insubstantial uses. Things like the gene manipulation for eye colour or facial features or something like that. And I think that sort of criticism is justified. But of course this is criticism of the misuse of genetics rather than of genetic advance itself. And I think similar criticism can be made of many other technological developments and even of some human abilities themselves. So I think what I would say is that humans playing God only becomes dangerous when they fail to utilize their godlike capabilities in ways that will deepen and enrich the lives of human beings. And so I think these sorts of negative images do have to be taken seriously. And yet I think they fail to negate the overall thrust of much of scientific advance. In other words, genetic advance per se is not synonymous with pride and arrogance. It's not an aping of God's power, because all forms of genetic therapy owe their rationale to that power. And so as long as the aim of therapy is the alleviation of human illness, it has the potential to elevate God's images. But of course, there are always dangers. And the notion of playing God should remind us that we are only to modify fundamental biological processes with enormous caution and with deep humility. There is much we do not know, and there is much over which our control is tenuous and fragile at best. And so playing God, then, if I continue to use that term, it's an exercise in responsibility. It demands intelligence, compassion, and discernment. And so it's not an exercise to be entered into frivolously. But then the question comes, who is playing God? And I think the general assumption is that it is these awful people like doctors and scientists. These are the groups who are tempted to transgress boundaries. I think that's very interesting, because we don't generally seem to think that artists or composers play God in this negative sense. After all, Did Fra Angelico or Michelangelo or Picasso or Henry Moore play God? Probably not. What then about Bach or Mahler or John Tavener? I think we'd probably be more inclined to say that at least some of these glorify God in their compositions, and they're not trying to usurp his authority. Why then do we set apart the activities of scientists? But I think this question of who is playing God goes even further than this. Because in the end, if anyone is playing God, it's us. It's ordinary people and not arrogant scientists. And I want to take you through an illustration. Think of a couple with cystic fibrosis in their family. And I'll take them through a few stages over quite a number of years and different periods. In their first pregnancy, some years ago, there were reasons to be concerned that the fetus may have cystic fibrosis. They used amniocentesis, some fetal cells were tested using a gene probe for cystic fibrosis. And they knew beforehand that if this turned out to be positive, they had a choice to make. The choice was either continue with the pregnancy, knowing that the child would be afflicted with this debilitating and distressing condition, particularly if we push it a few years back in time, or have an abortion. Now, these two young people are having to make agonizing choices. They're ordinary people. They don't have any sophisticated scientific or theological knowledge. But they have to determine the fate of embryos and children who will one day become adults. The situation facing them isn't of their own making. They would never have elected to have to cope with a tragic disease like cystic fibrosis. They have no control over the gene underlying this condition. And so the decisions they make, whatever they make, and whether we agree with them or not, they have nothing to do, it seems to me, with heroics or hubris. They are simply trying to sort out the dimensions of their family life in the midst of burdens and tears. And so again, if we continue to use this term, they are forced to play God. Not because of arrogance, but because of necessity. They have to act responsibly, or they should act responsibly, by choosing what they hope will be the better path, even though they are pitifully aware of the morally tainted nature of any choices they make. And they have no escape from this. So whatever they do, momentous decisions are going to be taken. And people are playing God because they must play God. Well, let's now imagine a few years further on, they want to conceive again. On this occasion, they're informed that the embryo itself can be genetically tested before it has a chance to implant in the uterus. The technique, of course, of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, or PGD. 2 cells will be removed from an early embryo. If PGD shows that the embryo doesn't have any indication of cystic fibrosis, it'll be transferred to the wife's uterus in the normal way. On the other hand, if the tests are positive, the embryo will be discarded and the procedure will be carried out on a second embryo and repeated again until a negative result is obtained. Now you see this couple is confronted by a different set of dilemmas. And they revolve around the respective values of a 4 or 8 cell embryo and a child, ultimately a child. Once again, they are playing God by making decisions which have profound implications for at least one future individual, and even for those who will never develop beyond being very early embryos, depending on what decision they take. So it's their family and their children that are at stake, and they're making truly godlike decisions. Now, my argument is that they have no choice, because for them there is no escape from the reality of cystic fibrosis and its devastating effects on any children they bring into existence. In a futuristic scenario, one can envisage the use of gene therapy to modify embryos, which gets us way into the area of genetic manipulation, which is where I don't want to go tonight. But you see, what I think should be emerging is that the transition from conventional approaches to genetic ones has been gradual. We've moved into high technology. yet the decision-making isn't dramatically different from that of a less sophisticated era. This form of technology hasn't suddenly introduced the notion of playing God. That's been present all along. What's changed has been its dimensions. So there'll be risks, and people like this young couple will have to exercise responsibility. But it seems to me that this is what being human is all about. We can't claim that we are made in the image of God and then walk away from what that means. And what it means is to exercise responsibility, to attempt to improve the world for ourselves and others, to understand as much as we can, and to control what can be controlled. And again, if we want to keep using this term playing God, as you'll see I'm a bit ambivalent about it, but let's just use it for the sake of simplicity. Playing God like this is essential for God-like creatures. Now that might sound very dangerous, but I think it protects us from the illusion that we actually are gods and that we can do anything. We can't do anything. As we play God, we realize we have limitations and that we are utterly dependent in the end upon the one who's our creator. Now you'll notice that I've retained this term playing God simply for the sake of simplicity, and in a sense to draw a contrast between its negative connotations and what I take to be far more positive ones. Now it may well not be the best term from a Christian angle, but I think it has the merit of immediacy. It has the connotations of fulfilling a God-given mandate to serve others, to care for the vulnerable, and to heal. And it acknowledges that humans are to participate in the process of transforming the world by sustaining it, restoring it, and improving what's been temporarily entrusted to us. The material world, including human beings, could be better than it is. And humans have the responsibility to attempt to achieve this, even if it's in a limited fashion. Now, of course, pride and arrogance are certainly dangers, but I would say so are sloth and lethargy. And of course, pride and arrogance are the ones frequently highlighted in this sort of debate. But I think sloth and lethargy are all too often ignored. Now, let me make something quite clear. This couple coping with cystic fibrosis doesn't have to go in a technological direction, and I'm not saying that. What I am saying is they do, and so, in other words, they don't have to choose against embryos and future individuals with cystic fibrosis. What I'm saying is they do have to choose. They have to make choices. And they have to live with the repercussions and the consequences of those choices. And of course, these consequences could include children with cystic fibrosis, children without cystic fibrosis, and embryos and then later fetuses that will never live as children suffering from cystic fibrosis, simply because they haven't been allowed to develop further, either in PGD or abortion. What I'm saying is that a couple like this can never escape from one or other of these, because they and we are creatures who live in community. I'm not saying what decision they should take, but they have to take a decision which will have considerable consequences, whatever it is. Okay, you might say, but don't put couples like this into this predicament. Wouldn't it be far better if we left well alone and refused to go in any technological directions like these? Why not accept what nature brings, or if you like, what God brings, depending obviously on one's perspective? I think no matter how the question is phrased, the basic assumption is that it is responsible to leave well alone. In other words, what it's saying is there is virtue in ignorance. There is something good about a lack of control. There is something of merit in mystery and in the unknown. Now, of course, if we wind back the clock of this scenario far enough, we'll come to a time when there was no amniocentesis. There were no gene probes for cystic fibrosis. There was no PGD. There was no means of fertilizing embryos in the laboratory. And some may argue that those were halcyon days with little decision-making, no destruction of embryos, and no abortions for therapeutic reasons. I would say that any serious arguments along these sorts of lines are doing little more than seeking refuge from decision-making in ignorance and disease. the couple in question would be left having to cope with one or more children dying from cystic fibrosis in childhood. And so the ideal, so-called, are young lives blighted by tragically foreshortened existences. Now, of course, that may not be the ultimate of tragedies. And, of course, children like this can bring profound blessings and joy to some families. Of course they can. The question is, though, is there any virtue in suffering from cystic fibrosis if there are ways in which the situation can in some way be ameliorated? And I think these are quite fundamental issues because they force us to come to terms, within the theological context anyway, of our picture of God and God's domain. How much do we leave to God? And how much is it legitimate for us to do? Do we simply sit back and let God sort everything out? Or has he given us the responsibility, the authority and the power to sort out much for ourselves? I would start from the foundation that humans are to exercise dominion over nature and that we are to free ourselves as far as we can from its constraints. And in carrying out these mandates, we are to act as good stewards of God's creation, realizing that there is much in his creation that isn't as it should be. The thing is, of course, there are no easy answers, because we frequently have to live with ambiguity and with deep uncertainties. Often we are torn in different directions. Often we don't know which is the best course of action. We may well not know which way is pleasing to God, or which way is the best for society, what will best serve other human beings. And so I can sympathize with people who long for a world in which these sorts of choices don't have to be made. But I don't agree with them. Let me return then just to this couple with cystic fibrosis, just to see where a little bit of further reflection might lead us. If the couple consents to any of their embryos being destroyed, it's because these particular embryos carry a gene that will result in children with cystic fibrosis. So either way, they are confronted by an agonizing moral choice, whether to dispose of the embryos or implant them in the woman's uterus, knowing that a resulting child will suffer from a debilitating disease. Now, I realize, of course, you may not go down this direction if that was what they would do, but in a sense, I think it's worth thinking like this. And one can say that the easy way out, possibly the morally preferable way out of this dilemma, is via ignorance. They're unaware of the options and they can do nothing about them. And so they are shielded from making a difficult and perhaps an invidious decision. They will simply take what comes. Now, of course, that's precisely the position in which we repeatedly find ourselves. And yet so often we regard this as a position of weakness rather than of strength. Ignorance is not a virtue when confronted by malaria, tuberculosis or dysentery, or by measles or smallpox, about which something can be done. In these instances, we would argue that knowledge is preferable to ignorance, although, of course, in the earlier part of the 20th century, ignorance reigned supreme. So if we opt for knowledge over ignorance, the choice between human embryos and the health status of future children has to be made in cases like the one that I've been outlining. At a more general level, one can argue that research on human embryos raises similar issues, where the anticipated outcome of the research, even though it might be some distance into the future, is improvement of human health. And so the general thrust of acting as God's stewards comes into play here as well. There are two possible courses of action, both of which have problematic elements. And this is where Christians, as well as many others within our communities, reach different conclusions. And from a Christian perspective, this is an issue because specific biblical teaching and precise theological guidance are unavailable. A common approach is to seek a definitive answer to the question of when human life or when personhood begins. But I think, as the case of cystic fibrosis illustrates, the ethical dilemma so often emerges out of the choice that has to be made between the interests of early embryos and that of children and subsequently adults who will have a potentially serious medical condition. And I think that to greater or lesser degrees, this will always be the choice. I've looked at it at an individual level. Sure, one could look at it at the level of society. But I think these are the sorts of conflicts that I think should form the sort of parameters within which we think of the more esoteric things, like when human life begins. Okay, but you might ask, well, isn't this designing babies? So I've dealt with one term, one phrase that the media love, playing God. Now I've come to the other one, designing babies. And again, a term which is generally used negatively. Designing babies is one of those things we should not do because it's going too far. For Christians, this might mean it's doing something that should be left in the hands of God where it rightfully belongs. And so it brings us back then to playing God in this negative sort of sense that I've been touching on. And simply because the design of babies is said to be a clear manifestation of playing God in a foolhardy manner. Now, it seems to me that the central problem with this designer babies debate is its unrealistic nature, because it's based on a set of misleading images of the notion of what designing a human being might entail, and I think on a serious lack of appreciation of the state of genetic science. I think the ease with which the term designer baby is employed is matched only by a fear of the ever-increasing scientific control of some humans over the nascent lives of other humans. The question, I think, always behind this is, well, are human beings becoming far too efficient in their manipulatory abilities? And are they leaving far too little to chance or divine control, however you want to phrase it? I think those who readily refer to designing babies, they're equally free in their references to making babies to order. And if babies are made to order, they'll subsequently be treated as little more than impersonal products. Because after all, that's what design is all about. The more precise and the more sophisticated the design has been, the more effective and acceptable the product will be. Tell me what you want, and that's what you'll be provided with. And of course, it's a very short step from here to the dubiously fascinating, and I think the repulsive picture of the factory production of babies. I'm sure you've seen plenty of pictures in Time magazine and other similar publications where you've got these babies coming out of some big machine, as of course in terms of human reproductive cloning. And so we've got these routinely presented pictures of babies being spewed out of machines in endless identical lines. And of course, pictures like this are deeply disconcerting, and quite naturally, we recoil from them. Trouble is, I think, though, that these provocative and grossly misleading images, with their oppressive overtones of a manufacturing process, they're all too readily then immediately applied to any genetic intervention in embryos. Change one gene or discard one embryo in favour of another, and you've got a designer baby. But I think this does nothing to advance serious debate. After all, the production of a particular model of car is characterised by precision, equivalence, and uniformity. There's no room for individuality on the production line, because each car has to conform to the specifications of whatever the model is. And so when I buy a car, I expect it to perform exactly as all other examples of that particular model. And the last thing that I want, and I'm sure it's the same with you, is to have a few interesting quirks that no one has ever predicted and no one can put right. Neither do I expect my car to change its character as each year passes. Sure, it might go downhill a bit, but not in any more profound way. And I think, to use a biological analogy, its manufacture is entirely genetic in character. There's no environmental component, because no development can take place once it's come off the production line. And so were the cloning of human beings or any genetic intervention to result in this sort of reproducibility, then of course we'd be rightly alarmed. But an environmental component is implicit in the production and subsequent development of all human beings, whether cloned or naturally fertilized. And it's this that separates human reproduction, even I think when it has impersonal elements, but it separates it from any factory manufacturing process. And so in this sense, then, the term biological manufacture is a misnomer. We'll never produce babies in the same way as we produce cars, washing machines, or computers, even if we try to do it. And therefore, I think these analogies are seriously misleading. So if design then involves precision and predictability, there's no way in which babies and future human individuals will ever be designed by people like us. Now, this, of course, doesn't justify all the procedures in the artificial reproductive technologies, but it should make us careful that we are not misled by the terminology we use. And so what about the science? Well, again, I think there are problems. So often the focus appears to be on genes for fair hair, blue eyes, intelligence, physique, all those sorts of things, even for avoiding baldness, etc., etc. Now, it seems to me what really strikes me is the ephemeral nature of all these sorts of longings. And I think all it does is to demonstrate their superficiality, let alone an ignorance of the scientific precision, the clinical complexities, and the expensive resources that would be required to achieve them. The trouble is, though, in much, I think, of ethical debate, that instead of demythologizing these fantasies as empty claims, they're taken seriously. And they are used by some people to construct tirades against realistic and therapeutically based genetic choice. And so this sort of choice can be dismissed on the ground that its goal is that of producing perfect babies designed to order. And so what you get in so much of the debate are these twin themes of perfectibility and design. And of course, both of these carry very powerful negative overtones. And for some, the message is that science is assuming redemptive powers. And the emphasis so often seems to be on saying that salvation can be found in biological manipulation, and the hope of a better life will come from genetic intervention. It's the sort of way in which a lot of the arguments seem to go. But it seems to me that what's required is not this, but a rigorous assessment of the merits of what can and cannot be accomplished by genetic science. And we need to ask what can be realistically accomplished to benefit the person or the patient. And I think this should be our starting point. Its focus should be on the good of the person, with a commitment to improve the quality of that person's life, and if feasible, to replace illness by health. It's a positive hope, but it's also a realistic one. After all, we know that the genetic intervention may not work. Hopes might be dashed. But I think the attempt is to be encouraged as long as our expectations are guided by realistic clinical and scientific goals. You see, in this sort of picture, there's no hint of perfection or of ageless existence in a disease-free body. The dominant value here is that of humility. Caring for those in need and utilizing what are sometimes very powerful technologies in the service of those who at least are potentially capable of benefiting from them. All right, then. Well, let's say that we can get rid of design as a sort of pure factory production sense. Let's say we won't contemplate that. Where then does that leave us then when it comes to the genetic manipulation of embryos? I think this is very much closer to a realistic view of where biomedical science is currently at and of how it may develop in the foreseeable future. Let me come back and just say one or two more things about pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, or PGD, which I've already touched on. As I've said, only embryos that are free from the condition are transferred to a woman, in the expectation, of course, that a normal pregnancy will develop. Now, inevitably, of course, this involves selecting embryos, and some people are very concerned about the notion of selection. It certainly does involve selecting embryos, but of course one could say with any IVF there is selection of embryos all the time going on. So there is selection of embryos. With PGD, it's selecting those that are not genetic carriers of the particular disease trait and discarding those that have the gene responsible for the disease. Now, PGD was first developed in 1990, and there are three types of abnormalities which it's mainly used for. First of all, there are single gene defects that cause disorders like cystic fibrosis that I've been mentioning, or Tay-Sachs disease. Second, there are the numerical chromosomal abnormalities, things like Down syndrome or Turner syndrome. And then there are, thirdly, structural chromosomal abnormalities like various forms of translocation. I don't want to go into those anymore. A drawback, of course, with PGD is that it can only be used in conjunction with IVF. In other words, fertilization has to take place in the laboratory using IVF. And of course, there are all cost issues to do with this, etc., which I'm not going into. Now, one of the features of PGD is that, of course, it enables the sex of embryos to be readily determined. That's both an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage is that when dealing with sex-linked genetic conditions like haemophilia, Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, it enables embryos of the appropriate sex to be selected so the resulting child won't suffer from the condition in question. And that, of course, is what's required. The disadvantage is that sex selection can be used for social control of the next generation by providing parents with a child of the preferred sex. And, of course, this form of sex selection has nothing whatsoever to do with anything medical or therapeutic. And, of course, it has to be debated on its own terms when you come to it. Now, some people refer to babies born after PGD as designer babies, because there's interference at a very early stage of their development. Now, I have to say, in my view, this isn't design in any meaningful sense, even though choices are being made between embryos. But I think in terms of design, the choice is an extremely crude one. After all, if I go into a shop to buy a jacket, and I've decided that there are two that I like, but I decide in the end that jacket A is preferable to jacket B. Now, I don't suddenly think that I've become a clothes designer. All I've done is make a selection from the two available. And in a sense, PGD is similar. Sure, it's rather more sophisticated. But the design control is negligible. Now, of course, we don't have to travel in this direction, and PGD doesn't have to be undertaken. But once an appropriate procedure is available, choices are inevitably being made, even if the decision is to refrain from utilizing the procedure. Now, let me just broaden out a little and just look at something to do with creativity and the image of God. One of the fundamental tenets of Christian theology is that humans are created in the image and likeness of God. And this points towards God as the original in some sense, with human beings as, in some senses, copies of that original. We imitate God by acting in some areas as he acts. And so the moral responsibility characteristic of humans is an echo of the moral responsibility of God, enshrining as it does the capacity to act wisely and in love. And so we have a mandate to heal and to restore God's creation. Now, a traditional understanding of this theme is that of humans as stewards who conserve and protect what God has created. And at the heart of a conservative interpretation is an emphasis upon therapy. Therapy with its attempts to rectify what has gone wrong and to restore people to some functioning state as far as possible. And so we are to restore the world rather than accept it in some fatalistic manner. We are to understand, protect, care for, develop, nurture, etc., and manage the earth for God and for other people. In other words, we are to change the world for good, even though this is often not what might happen in practice. But I think in spite of incipient dangers, God doesn't readily abrogate human freedom. Decision-making is central to human life. It's a privilege, it's a responsibility. But the immensity of this responsibility is held in check by a further consideration, and this is that God is to be placed firmly at the center of human existence. The dangers, of course, are immense, because God is readily replaced by technological achievement and human prowess. On the other hand, human freedom may be limited by imposing arbitrary rules and regulations. And I think both lead to the same endpoint, and that's a loss of an elevated view of human dignity and a loss of God-bestowed freedom. Now, although I've branded this traditional interpretation as a conservative one, I think it's only conservative in a very broad sense. If followed through, it seems to me it allows the use of many creative therapeutic ventures, as long as their bottom line is the attainment of wholeness, or trying to get towards wholeness. In other words, the use of artificial devices, means of bypassing normal functioning, and many forms of experimentation, seems to me can all be accommodated under this umbrella. Because what's important is the welfare of the patient, the person being treated, and not the maintenance of some unchanging and rigidly defined norm. But is the extent of human creativity greater than this? Does it incorporate the mandate to go beyond preserving what God has already created and to participate in what may be described as additional acts of creation, or perhaps getting towards enhancement, to use different terminology? And it's in this sense that humans are referred by some writers as being co-creators with God, or as one writer puts it, the created co-creator. And the emphasis with these terms is on humans as co-workers with God, because human work is needed if God's full purposes in the universe are to be realized. Now, theoretically, I think this is a much expanded view of human intervention in the world, because, according to this view, the world is still a world in progress, and its fulfillment is at least partially dependent on our interacting with it through the creative use of our freedom. Now, I'm certainly not going to try and argue the respective merits of these particular theological interpretations. What I would say, though, is from my far more pragmatic stance, I doubt whether they lead to substantially different positions in practice. What I've already done is to emphasize what I see as the breadth of a therapeutically based approach. And I have no problem in envisaging that this accommodates procedures like IVF for infertility, somatic cell gene therapy, neural grafting, and even pre-symptomatic interventions at the embryonic stage to alleviate or to bypass certain major diseases. Now, that sort of list isn't automatic justification for any of those procedures. It's simply an affirmation they can all be governed by a therapeutic rationale. So in the end, what is crucial is the welfare of all the individuals concerned, and of course the overall good of society. The determining question is always to be what will uphold human dignity and human value, both now and, as far as we can determine, in the future. And so finally, where have I got you and myself to? Well, I think where I've ended up is to say that there is a place for design within genetics and within other biomedical areas, but design of a far more limited and humble variety than so often encountered in these sorts of debates. It's very far removed from the bravado and the hubris associated with the picture of a factory production line of identical and preordained babies. The challenge is to determine how we do these things and under what circumstances we do them, because this is where things like responsibility, judgment, and wisdom come into play. We can't do anything we like. We shouldn't want to do anything we like. But we should do all we can to improve the quality of the lives of those around us, whether by using biological means or simply by treating them as beings of importance and as people who matter. This, it seems to me, is where Christians should be contributing to this debate, which of course is a hugely broad debate within society. Divine grace and creativity are evident in all of these realms, and I think human creativity is to follow suit. If we can say that God works through creation, and therefore through what we describe as the natural world, there's no reason to say that he doesn't also work through the basic processes described by biology, and therefore through genetic and allied mechanisms. If that's true, we can go on to say that genetic modification brought about by humans, genetic design if you like, has at least the potential for extending the work of God. Now, of course, this has enormous dangers and pitfalls, because appallingly injudicious choices can be made. But of course that's true of every other area of human life as well. And what I'm arguing is that humility is essential for rigorously assessing the merits of what can and cannot be accomplished by genetic science. It's a humility which should be a part of the science. It's a humility which we should have as humans looking in on the science. And so the sort of framework that I've used is what I would call a therapeutic and a person-centered framework. And using this, I think our eyes can be directed towards what can realistically be accomplished to benefit the patient, the person, perhaps people in general, depending on what level we're looking at it. And I think this is a far cry from the hubris sometimes encountered. But I think it's also a far cry from what I would call the anti-hubris that has become so caught up in the fear of extravagant claims that has lost sight of the good that could be accomplished by utilizing some of these technologies. But I think here, and this is my final point, I think there's a cautionary lesson here. And this is we are to beware of obsession with the normal. I know the normal is a term which one has to define, etc. Just saying for the moment, to beware of obsession with the normal. And of course, that could be accentuated by any of the current biomedical technologies. And what I mean by that is we only allow into the world the normal, the ideal. We only, in a sense, have concern for normal individuals. Therefore, we get into huge problems with those who are not normal. So I think we have to beware of obsession with the normal, and I have no doubt that the sort of technologies we have tend to push us in that direction. The genetic realm, it seems to me, is as limited as any other, and talk of designing wonderful new human beings is utterly futile. On the other hand, the rejection of a modicum of limited and very cautious design is, I think, the outcome of a spirit of fear rather than a spirit of faithfulness. In Christian terms, we are to do what is consistent with the nature and the purposes of God. We are to assess all scientific developments by the benchmark of whether they appear to forward God's work in creation. Now, of course, these are daunting tasks, and in a sense, we're always all inadequate to deal with them. But I think they are enriched when theological, scientific, and ethical insights are brought to bear on them in an integrated fashion. And I have to say, one of my comments as someone who is basically a scientist, who has got considerable interest in ethics, is I think so often some of the ethical and sometimes some of the theological debates would be much better and much better informed if they were utilizing somewhat more of the scientific and the serious science. On the other hand, of course, one could say perhaps some scientists would perform a little better if they had more insights from the ethical and other spheres. Okay, I'll leave it at that.